Welcome back to the Policy Studies and Decision Making course. Today, we will discuss about the first instrument called scenario planning. These are the main references that you may learn by yourself at home. Have you ever thinking about these questions? How do we compete successfully in an endlessly changing world? Some of you may think that adaptations and speed are among the most crucial factors to be successful in an endlessly changing world. You may be true, but not 100% true. You can see how an elephant on the top of the ball, how is the strategy to keep survive on that kinds of situations? The only option is only by continuously looking for new balance points which may need adaptations and speed. This is called strategic flexibility. You may find a true example of strategic flexibility among fighter pilots. They need to have the mentality of the so-called OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, and act to win the dogfights, otherwise they will lose. But flexibility is not enough. Besides, you need to be fast and to be adaptive. You need to ensure that you have a balance between stability and flexibility as well. Baptist and Heath call this strategic response capability. This represents strategy of human survivals in order to survive in an endlessly changing world. Lindgren and Van Holt propose a very interesting framework to predict strong performance in rapid and complex environment. They propose 3 dimensions, namely thinking, playing, and gardening dimension. The thinking dimension consisting of activities to anticipate change. This covers activities such as research, focus group discussions, and so on to prepare a planning. On the other hand, the playing dimension represents the entrepreneurial sides of organizations. By the time the organizations try to implement various kind of activities. And the last dimension, gardening dimension, is very important to ensure the stability of the organizations, among others, through cultural control. Can you imagine an organizations that heavily focusing on thinking dimension only and neglecting playing dimension? These organizations will become a champions of planning without any further progress. On the other hand, an organization that focusing only on playing without investing sufficient time to think, it will be really inefficient in terms of cost, in terms of effort, and so on. So make sure that an organization able to spend sufficient time for all of these 3 dimensions. Now we are back to our first questions. How do we compete successfully in an endlessly changing world? A successful organization, perhaps like a child that keep questioning the laws, that always try to experimenting theoretically, and also to challenge mom's word by asking what happens if we mix this and this and this together. And as a child, we may also need a good parents. A good parents may represent our supervisors, our boss, our colleagues, our partners, that playing their roles to remind us by the time we are already crossing the border lines, that their mission is actually to remind us to be cautious about the level or about the area within which we are still able to explore. Now we are entering to our main focus of the day, scenario planning. Before continuing further, we must know what exactly scenario or scenario planning. You may find various kinds of definitions of scenario or scenario plannings in the literatures, but the most popular one, perhaps the definition provided by Porter, which say that scenario is an internally consistent view of what future might turn out to be. And can you imagine if this box represents our today's point of view and we are trying to predict what will happen in the future? And a job of predicting future within a week frame of time, perhaps not that challenging in comparisons to create a prediction or scenario for 5 or 10-year futures because so many and more variables will need to be accommodated. We need to differentiate between three following terms, namely the forecast, scenarios, and visions. Let's start with visions. It's quite frequent that we found in organizations that the visions usually an energizing element to motivate organizational members to support the organizations. Meanwhile, the forecast, which is really close to our daily life situations, for instance, the weather forecast, is the predictions in a short-term perspective, in a short-term way, by connecting certain relations of available data. And the degree of uncertainty is relatively low. In contrast to the first two terms, scenario deals with the mid and long terms of uncertainties, because this really need us to dig out so many various kinds of variables in order to portray the possible futures. That's the reason why we really need to learn about the methodology to employ scenario approach. Considering the complexity and the efforts that may be needed to do a scenario planning, you need first to ensure the reason why you need to choose scenario planning as your tool to help your decision-making process. Because this will need you to dig out uncertainties and also to accommodate various kinds of variables. As you can see here, that scenario planning can be addressed as an instrument to reach various kinds of purposes. As an actual example, perhaps it's very interesting to discuss about the scenario planning at British Airways. Why does British Airways need scenario planning? As the background, travel air business always be a business with very highly sensitive to economic cycles. And the British Airways decided to do scenario plannings by the time they are still at the top. And it is very frequent that we find managers are focusing mostly on day-to-day running of the operations. And if we look at our organizational budget, how many of the organizations really estimate more than 3 years? I believe most of the organizations only have an annual plan, not really a midterm kinds of plan. This is very dangerous to the organization. Former British Airways chief economist Dean Julius was the one who tried to propose scenario planning as a tool to predict the futures of British Airways to the Chairman's Committee back to February 1994. But somehow, the committee was a bit hesitant about this initiative, mainly because the expected benefits were somewhat intangible. But Dean Julius successfully convincing the committee to at least provide her a chance to do an experiment and to see what will be happening for the benefits of the company. And under her leadership, the exercise of scenario planning consists of two phases, namely scenario development and scenario workshops. It is very interesting to follow what has been done by the chief economist to do the scenario planning. During the first phase of the scenario development, they are trying to create small team members consisting of representative of the key units plus an external consultant. In addition to that, in order to secure top-level support and guidance for the project, she created the so-called Halo Group that incorporates 14 directors and senior managers represented all managers' departments. There are two main tasks under the first phase, namely to determine the significant external issues facing by the airline. The second one is developing plausible issues that might be challenging for the British Airways. In conducting the first task, they are doing 5 steps systematically, starting by designing the interview guidelines and then conducting individual and group interviews with various stakeholders, and then Based on that data, they are trying to develop a story of the official future. Following creations of the story, they try to allocate a full day of debating the issues to prioritize 11 top issues for further research. Finally, step 5, they present the finding to the Halo group to seek confirmations and feedback, especially on the official features and the selected research agenda. Continuing further with the second task, based on the achievement of the first task, the 11 issues that were identified then assigned to specific team, 2 teams where each team tried to do a desk-based research to create a brief packs of each issue. Afterwards, they organized 2 days of sharing findings and exploring interconnections between issues. And as a result, they try to develop 2 stories, each covering a 10-year time horizon. And then they try to draft a scenario stories in the forms of PPTs and also to build a model and creating the final draft to the committee for approval. Finally, a revised version of the stories was drafted by external consultant and finalized by the chief economist. And after receiving final approval from the Halo group, a booklet of the stories was produced. As a result of the first phase activities, they have identified the key driving forces and also 2 scenarios within years time of span. Phase 2 scenario workshops disseminates the results of the first phase, namely the stories and so on, and also to gather feedbacks from departments and key stakeholders. So in order to do that, the heads of planning was assigned to lead a team consisting of 5 facilitators to design and manage the workshops. The workshop itself tried to provide as a forum for participants to hear and discuss about the scenario and also to provide feedback on how is the strategy to bring the stories to anticipate possible future occurrence with the better preparations. The targeted participants are directors and senior managers with responsibilities for the major components of the business plan. Phase 2 consisting of 2 main tasks with 2 objectives. The first objective is to design and to develop technique plus marketing. The second objective deals with facilitating the workshops around 8 hours per session. The first task is to design and to marketize the workshops. The team needs to brainstorm to develop techniques to convince the stakeholders to facilitate the workshops. Then the most valuable ideas among them were further developed and summarized into strategic statements. And then they also try to develop and to evaluate one scenario to another scenario, and then try to discuss whether any of the strategies could be modified to improve the robustness and making the strategy work. Finally, by the time they already prepared with the marketing tools and the content itself, they try to arrange appointments with individuals to explain benefits and added value of the workshops and to convince them to allocate the time and the resources to sponsor the workshop itself. The second part of the phase 2 is mainly to attract participants. Selections of participants, it's actually available, it's open to anyone in the airline based on request, but the targeted customers had the priority over others. As you can see here, that there's a teamwork between the facilitators and also the development team in terms of the organizing the workshops. And the client, to be underlined, need to pay for the event. It's not a free workshops. So the departments who organize the workshops need to pay for themselves. And during the workshops, the development team tried to share the details of the stories, and then all notes were typed up and sent out within a week of the workshops. And it's very interesting that the output was confidential to the participants only. And finally, the facilitators tried to summarize common themes and report the summary to the group's managing directors during the Halo group. Based on the British Airways case, what are the most important success criteria in introducing scenario planning? The first one is to gain support from the top level management, really from the beginning of the process. Second, plan it well. Take the time to do the design and research properly and showing some progress along the way. 3, treat the exercise as a learning process and consult as many as possible in the development process so they have the ownership with the final product. Perhaps you may find extra points, extra key factors that may also consider to be the most success criteria in terms of a successful scenario planning. That's all for today's sessions. Thank you very much. See you on the next video.